thank you for joining us again here on Rebel Voices in Education, a diversity and inclusion webcast.
Each week we'll bring you a panel of guests who will offer their insight and experience in diversity and inclusion in education and answer your questions. I'm Hannah Jepson, business psychologist and co-founder of LGBT Ed.
And I'm Amy Ferguson, teacher of performing arts and deputy head teacher. Our guests today are Mamus and Kiran, both women of colour in education. Welcome, both of you, this morning. For those of you who haven't met Kiran and Mamus together, they're going to tell us a little bit about themselves and their teaching experience. Kiran, we'll start with you.
Hi, thank you, Amy. My name's Kiran Mahil. I'm a history and politics teacher in East London, soon to become assistant head teacher.
Hi, my name is Mamus Emosivwe. I am a PE teacher. I'm going to be a head of PE in a school in Wandsworth.
Thanks so much. Each week we start by asking our panel our Rebel Voices questions. So the first question from us is, as women of colour in education, what has your experience been of diversity and inclusion in schools?
Well, I think first to say actually that I feel quite lucky and privileged to hold the position that I do in society. I wouldn't really trade in being a teacher for anything else. I think if you believe in the values of an inclusive society, schools are a really powerful place to kind of bring those values to life. So I have, I try to live those values. I do believe that no person, no child should be left behind. I do believe that the talents of everybody should be utilised. Not only is that the fair and just thing to do, but it just makes sense. It's economically, it makes sense to ensure that everybody can reach their full potential. And I think in education, that's not always necessarily the case in curriculum. It's not always the case that everybody is alive and well. I'll talk about my history experience in particular. I've made sure that, women's voices are there. Women have been a part of the past, whether we know it or not, but you've got to actively find that material. Similarly, when it comes to global history or even British history, and you're making sure that it's a kind of complete narrative. So I think it's clear that our curriculum isn't as inclusive as it should be. When you're teaching in a classroom in the capital city in 2020, you need to make sure that you're doing justice to the subject discipline that you teach, and you seek the truths within that, and you've got to make sure it's the complete truth. So it hasn't been there, and I've tried to do it, working with others. It's never a single effort. But I think, those are the positives, those are the joys that come within it. But there are frustrations. Of course, there is. The idea that diversity and inclusion is the work of women or people of colour or women of colour. So not only do you have to sort of live the oppression, you then are the ones responsible for making good on that. And that's certainly been a part of my experience. Probably well intended by the people who have asked for that sort of contribution, but not necessarily, I think, the right way to do things. And I probably hadn't noticed many inhibiting factors, negative factors, until I became a mom. So I'm a mom of two young girls, almost 5 and 3.5, and that in itself is a challenge. But I think when becoming a mom, I noticed very much so how I was potentially marginalised from the workplace. So there was one appraisal meeting, for example, when I asked about what could I do to make more of a whole school contribution. I had my specific targets, but what can I do? I feel as though I've got a bit of experience now, a bit of time. I understand, institutional knowledge, so I can probably help out a bit more. And I was just, the response from my line manager was, "Oh, look, you're a mum of 2 young children. You've probably got your hands full. You're busy enough." And I hadn't mentioned my family dynamic within that meeting at all. I may have wanted to, and I think that's fine, to be honest about what you can and can't do. But given I hadn't done that within the 30 minutes we were having a conversation, I was pretty taken aback by the offer to do more. Was met with "Don't worry, love," basically. And therefore I was pretty taken aback that that had been a part of the conversation to kind of stop me contributing to whole school life.
Thank you, Kiran. That's and actually not dissimilar to some of the stories we've heard in previous weeks about the onus sometimes being put on those minoritized or marginalized groups to further this work, which is kind of a weight to bear. I'm just interested, you talking about being a woman of colour, being and also mum, that kind of the intersectionality of that, the how layered it is in terms of the barriers that you might face, and how do you navigate that in terms of those kind of different things with which you identify?
I think that's a really good question, because actually you just don't know which parts of your identity are the problem sometimes. You are what you are. It's like you said, it's multi-layered. I'm from a working class background. It's first to go to university. I'm a woman, I'm a person of colour, I'm a mum. You have all of these things going on. Some people might just not like the way I do things. That's another reason as well. It's not always necessarily part of your identity, I suppose. It might be how you go about doing business. But I think with some thought, you just can't overthink it, because the burden is too much. You've got to have, my approach is complete positive regard for others, and I expect that to be the same for me. And of course, there are blatant situations like the one that I said, which you can say, that's not right for this reason, and you can call it out for what it is. And I think that's important, actually, because by doing that, you depersonalize it. It's not about you as it is about you as a person, but it's nothing that you can control in that sense, and therefore the issue lies with the other party rather than you. But I think basically a coping strategy that I tend to use is try not to overthink everything. If there is a case where it's clear that there's either discrimination or prejudice there, then consider it, talk to other like-minded people, have a support network, really talk it out, rationalize it a bit. And then if you feel that something needs to be said, or you need to go elsewhere for support because you don't think, you're not happy for things to be like that and it's wrong, then do that, but on your terms.
I think because of how I am, I've had to sort of look back as to what my experience is, because when I'm in it, I don't notice it, because I'm very much positive thinking, just move forward, just keep going. So when I look back on it, I do recognize that actually I have always been a minority, particularly in PE, one being a female PE teacher. And I've realized that I've actually always been the only Black female PE teacher. So I've always been the only one. Now, that hasn't necessarily been negative as such. But when it comes down to when I look at, I guess, sort of the school and, the structure in terms of the type of students that I get for GCSE maybe, or whatever it is, it always seems to be the same group. And it always seems to be underachieving Black boys. And so I look at it and I think, why is it that, this particular group of students are being pushed? And is it because, being pushed for this particular subject, especially in PE, you tend to find that the majority of students that are in there are either white working class boys or Black Caribbean boys. And I think when I look back at it, my experience as a teacher, it's always been, it's almost like I've been sort of unknowingly, I've had to be the champion for these students. I've had to be, and it's when I think of it, it has actually been quite a responsibility, because it's always me that they're asking. It's always, oh, what can we do for this group? Oh, what can we do for this group? So I think throughout my career, there's always been this level of responsibility that I've had to have, because I'm the Black PE teacher, because I'm a Black PE teacher. And I think at the time it didn't bother me. And to be honest, it doesn't really bother me now, because I'm just very much, just like Kiran said, I'm very much, every child has potential, no matter race, no matter gender, no matter faith, whatever it is, every child has potential. So I've always kind of just got on with it. But I think over my years of teaching, I haven't realized that that level of responsibility is something that has now become a part of how I do things and how I teach, because it now moves to the forefront of my mind. Okay, what can I do for this group of students? Because that responsibility has always been put on me unknowingly. And I think, yeah, so it hasn't been negative in that sense, but I guess because of, you know, the lack of diversity within schools, and even now, you know, we know that, especially in London, we know that London is a multicultural, it's a multicultural hub. You have every race, you have all, you know, all manner of people. And I think the fact that the onus and the responsibility still gets put on the marginalized group or the minority group, I think that's something where I've looked at it and been like, that needs to change. Because, you know, we are, like I said, you know, London is very diverse. London is, you know, multicultural. So I don't think it's fair. And this is just in retrospective, that, you know, I don't think it's fair that it should be, you know, people of color that have to push, I guess, the education or the learning of culture. I think it's something that should be intentional by all people, and not just for ourselves. But again, when I think about students, and I think about, you know, my students, or, you know, students that we teach, I think that it has to be done, because the way that we do school now, or the way that school looks now, is very, very different to, you know, sort of 10, 20 years ago. And so I think it's just important that we don't unknowingly and unconsciously put the responsibility on the ones that require, I guess, the help and the support, if that makes sense. So I think, like I said, whilst I was in it and whilst I'm working through it, I don't think about, you know, I didn't realize these things. I'm very much a positive person, just like, you know, Kiran, I'll just get it done. I don't have a problem with doing it. I'll just get it done if it is for the benefit of my students first and foremost, and then, you know, for the benefit of those that work around me. But I think when I look back, it's like, wow, I've really actually had a lot to do, and these things are really, you know, subconsciously, these are like the things that are at the forefront of my mind. Okay, what do I do for, in terms of representation of Black people? What do I do in terms of underachievement for Black boys? What do I do in terms of, you know, all these things? And that seems to come to my mind first before anything else. And I think that, I guess, is what has been the negative part of it, because it actually stops me from being able to, I guess, support all students, because you've made it a focus that I should be, you know, I should be supporting children of color. And yes, I want to do that because there is that inequality. And like I said, with underachieving Black boys, specifically those from the Caribbean, but I also want to be able to do my job for all children. And I'm going to need your help to be able to do that. It can't be that because I'm a teacher of color, my focus has to be on children of color. I want to be able to focus on all children. That is true diversity, and that is true inclusion. I want to be able to focus on all. So I guess that's the negative part of it when I look back. But like I said, I'm very much a positive person. So I'm glad that, you know, we're having these conversations, that people are aware that we're not just focused, you know, we're not just wanting to look after our own, as it were. The reason why we bring these things up is so that we can look after all, and we can look after all children. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. So when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion in schools, there are definitely some things that work and there are things that don't work. And there are things that are outstanding diversity and inclusion practice in schools. I'd like you to tell us what you think outstanding diversity and inclusion in schools looks like.
Yeah, I haven't seen many examples of, I guess, full diversity in schools. I think one of the things, you know, that we are all very aware of is the Black History Month. So there is always some form of assembly event that takes place in school, and that usually seems to be the go-to in terms of diversities in schools that I have worked in. It might be different for, you know, schools that you have worked in, but I think one thing, I think it's good that that is happening. It's good that that takes place. But I think what it is we have to recognize that there needs to be representation across the board. And, you know, it's not just, okay, you know, the famous people who are doing well and the famous people outside of the school setting. I think that that's great for students of colour to see that. And that's great for students of colour to see that. But I think we need to now look at what does the community, the diversity of the community of the school, because children spend a lot, you know, children, they spend a lot of time in school. It's at least, you know, 6 hours, you know, of the day. And I think it's important that we now begin to, let's not sort of look at what's happening outside and now begin to bring that in. And so I think for me, what diversity, you know, good diversity would look like is now beginning to really look at representation and, you know, not to sound, I know it's called rebel voices, but not to sound, you know, harsh or direct, but I think it cannot be done just to fill a quota, just so that you have on your stats that you have, you know, staff of colour. I think it needs to really be thought about very differently. It's not to meet a checklist or to tick a box. It needs to be that the reason why you are employing, you know, Black teachers or teachers of BAME, let me not even just focus on Black people, but teachers of colour, the reason why you are employing them is not only because they are good at their job, but also because you recognise that you have students of colour. You recognise that they need to be able to see the same success that you have seen in us in terms of our roles. They need to be able to see that same success as well. So I do think that the representation that you are showing outside of the school community, that now needs to be brought into the school community. So there does need to be more, more staffing in terms of that sense of representation, and not just in who they see immediately, but, you know, Kiran, yourself as a history teacher, seeing it within the subject knowledge as well, seeing it within the curriculum, seeing it in the different subjects and what that looks like. And, you know, it was, I have a friend, another teacher friend, you know, us teachers, we like to band together. So I have a friend and she is of Nigerian descent. And what she does is the school that she's in is mainly Black Afro-Caribbean students. So what she does is she puts, you know, Nigerian names in plastic, you know, she'll give exam papers and she'll tailor it ever so slightly and put in Nigerian names or common Caribbean names, and she'll put them in there just so that, you know, okay, you may not be able to relate, you know, your name is, this is just an example, a common Nigerian name, your name is Temi. You may not be able to relate to a question asking about Susan. That already, you might just turn off. It's just something that happens. So I think the representation of people of colour needs to go throughout the board, from the top all the way down. So through policy, all the way down into curriculum, teaching. And I think it's great that you have the Black History Month. It's great that you have these events that take place. But again, it's still removed because it's external. You're talking about people outside of the school community. It now needs to come into it. We now need to celebrate diversity and people of colour within the school community, because that's what they're seeing and that's what they're more likely to relate to. So yeah,
I think Mamus has made some excellent points. I think the issues regarding representation versus tokenistic measures is really important. And what I'd add to that is I think in some places, some schools, institutions, organisations, you get a sense, you get a feel that their values and what they say they are about is actually what they are about. It's not because they're plastered on the walls or laminated in every classroom. It's because every conversation, the things that you hear between students, between teachers and students, between colleagues, you know that the value of inclusion is there. And inclusion really means you value every single part of the role that everybody plays within your organisation. And I think, you know, schools are very hierarchical, and sometimes the messages that we send to students is quite confusing. you include everybody, but actually you have more respect or deference for these kind of teachers within your organisation. And you call these teachers by their names, or Miss or so, or you'll just call the TA. You know, those sorts of things really, really matter. How we treat one another within our school, I think, is is what I would, as a head teacher, if I ever get there, be the thing that I'm listening out for the most. How are we treating every single person within school? Because if we can do it here, then when we then leave this, you know, place of learning, hopefully that then filters out in how we treat everybody else in society. And that's where you get the learning, right? And that's where you get progress and hopefully societal growth, and the place where everybody is treated fairly and justly. And, you know, I hope we can get there at one point. So I think that's really important. Is it's a tricky thing within schools because they're hierarchical, but how do you make sure that value of everybody has a role to play, and everybody's work is of equal worth, even though we're doing different things, I think is really important. And it's where I would say I have a sense of really positive inclusion. I think the point about representation really matters. The statistics on women's leadership, on people of colour leadership within schools is shockingly bad. Like, there's no other word for it. It's not that the pipeline isn't there. There are plenty, you know, it's education it's one of the first professions that women were allowed to do. And therefore, you know, when you look at secondary in particular, the numbers of women getting to headship at secondary is just not representative of the workforce at all. So there is a problem within the system, but within every organisation as well. So I think when it works really well is actually when you've got your governing body or your trust asking these questions. You might have these policies, but how is it in practice? Are we constantly reviewing what we do? Who's leaving us and why? Who's joining us and why? What's their progression like and why? You've just always got to question it, because this area, diversity and inclusion, feels to me that the second you take things for granted, you take your foot off the pedal, it just goes backwards. It doesn't stand still, it goes backwards. And therefore, it is important that we remember it is a process. You can't say we've cracked it, we've done it, we've sorted our diversity and inclusion. There's no such thing. You know, you've got to always see where you are, question it, and recognise it's a process. Like Black History Month, that at that point when that was introduced into the curriculum, it's what people were calling for. You know, there was nothing there, so it's like, let's create this space. But, you know, 30 years on, surely we're at a time where we're like, well, that's tokenistic now. You know, there's a lot more knowledge, there's wealth of knowledge out there. We don't need a month, we can integrate it, and kind of that idea of usualize these experiences. So I really love that example of names in exam papers, just to make, you know, this is it's the country that we're growing up in. It shouldn't just be Susans and Toms. You know, particularly, I think we're both London teachers, so those names are actually in the minority in schools that I've been, but seem to be everywhere in terms of educational resources. So, you know, I think the point that I'd really like to make on this about outstanding inclusion and diversity is that it's not about, you know, I think this is a common kind of phrase, isn't it? It's not about, you're not here to be right, you're here to get it right. So it's that idea that it's not an affront if it's not there, if it's not perfect. I don't know where it is, but you have to actually have the will to make it happen. And you don't know if you're making it happen unless you're constantly reviewing your policies and practice. And sorry, the final point is, I don't think there is a magic formula, because context is really important. So diversity and inclusion in one school, in one community, would look very different in another, because it just depends who are the marginalised groups. And you've got to know your communities and best serve them.
Amazing, thank you. I think everyone who's listening probably are like, hoping you get to headship really soon, because you are making some amazingly sensible points, and I wish that there were more people making those points. So yeah, thank you, both of you, in fact. Final kind of Rebel Voices question from us, and then we'll go to some questions from the viewers or listeners. And we've talked about this a lot today, about kind of the onus being put on people of colour, the onus being put on women, the onus being put on those minorities to do this work. And also that kind of hierarchical nature of schools. It is a really kind of a hierarchical place and quite a complex ecosystem of stakeholders, isn't it, when you think about it, actually? So I guess we're interested in, what have you done, or what do you do to change hearts and minds in this space, to really make people understand all of the things that you've told us? So either give us an example, or just generally, what do you feel is the right thing to do to get people to move along the journey with you? Like Kiran said, seeing it as a process, but actually really changing people's hearts and minds.
Yeah, I would say that I'm still a bit of a newbie to this education game and teaching game. I've been teaching almost 6 years now, and so I guess I haven't had opportunity as such to champion, I guess, some of the ways that I've been thinking, because to be honest, some of the ways that I've been thinking have only come about recently. Like I said, I kind of just plod along, get the job done, but it is sort of on my mind. But I remember in one school that I was in, and funnily enough, it was a school in Brixton, and it was an all-girls school, and the student population as well as the staff population was actually 95% Black students, and that's something that they, put in their brochures, and it essentially was 95% Black. And what they had found is that, especially for PE, many of the posters that were being used were white women. And so they were trying to think of a way other than having posters of Black women around the school and things like that. And so I remember I play football, so I actually just brought it closer to home. And so for one of the after the football sessions, after school football sessions, I just asked a couple of my friends to come in and coach them instead, because they were used to just seeing, white women playing football, and that's what they saw on TV, and that's, what it was. So I kind of just brought a couple of my friends in and kind of just brought it closer to home. So I guess that's an example of what I have done in terms of, the point I made about representation and making it a bit more relative to them. What I am thinking about now, this is, my new role. I'm starting in September as head of PE. This is first time, doing it. So it's all new to me. But what I am thinking about now is I am very much a champion for excellence. And I'm trying to change the status quo of, young people of color. The only things that, you can do, I guess, are music and entertainment and sports. And I'm trying to change that status quo. As much as I am a PE teacher, my thing now that I'm trying to be is just being a champion of excellence, because excellence speaks volumes, regardless of color, creed, gender. Excellence speaks volumes. There is, it gives, I guess, that the person who's trying to stick to the archaic way that we have been doing school, it gives them no reason to put you down. It gives them no reason to, sort of cast you away or tell you that, you don't quite fit in because you do your job so well, you are needed. They can't, do anything about that. I'm not concerned as to, I guess, what you want to do or what your life goal is in that sense. My concern now is that you do it to its absolute best. And what that looks like for you is going to be very different. But the attitude that I want you to have is one of, it has to be done to its absolute best. I don't want it to be that you coast. I don't want it to be that you sort of do the bare minimum just to get by. I want it to be that, excellence is not just something that you do, but it's a culture that you have, and it runs through, your entire way of thinking. Because like I said, if you are doing something well and you do it extremely well, that begins to change the status quo. If you begin to realize as a student, you begin to realize that there is more to you than what society is showing you. You begin to realize that there is actually more that you can do. So particularly for people, young people of color, there is more to you, especially, and, I say young, I keep calling, to young Black boys, because that, is a group that I've seen where this is effective. But, there's more to you than being the newest YouTube sensation, or there's more to you than being the newest grime artist. There's more to you than being the newest, greatest footballer. And it's not to say that these things are not good and these things are not great, but you put yourself in a box because the society has told you that's the status quo. You've already put yourself and limited yourself because society has told you that's what we want you to be doing. In essence, that's what we want you to do. So what I'm trying to do now, and I think it's something that I've been trying to do within my teaching for the past few, 2 to 3 years, is championing excellence, because that way the sky's the limit, as it were. There is so many things that you can do, and it begins to open up your mind to the possibilities of things other than what society has said that you should be doing, as it were. So
Here, totally agree. Amazing. Thank you. Kiran, over to you.
Thanks for that motivational talk. I certainly feel lifted by hearing that. Yeah, the sky is the limit, right? I think absolutely. I think that's really great stuff in terms of talking to young people about this and making them feel that everything is possible with the effort that needs to be applied and the hard work that goes with it. I think those two really powerful messages. And I suppose, therefore, I've always felt this. I've always felt, when you move from leading your learning in your classroom to then leading other people within organisations, they're very similar. Those ideas of setting high aspirations, being very clear about what people can achieve and how, nudging people when they're falling short of that, probing and questioning. It's the same. Being a successful teacher, in my view, is really helpful for them being a successful leader, because ultimately the psychology of people we're humans. We're sort of similar. They might be younger than us, but we're essentially the same. So that stuff, I think, is also really transferable. What you were saying in how we kind of build. It might not be changing hearts and minds. It might be sort of that idea of inspiring, hearts and minds to kind of be whatever they want to do. I think that's similar in terms of when you're talking to staff and how they then expect that of students and how they then push themselves. I think what else do you use to change hearts and minds of people when it comes to diversity and inclusion? I mean, it's almost a question you don't really want to have to answer, isn't it? Like, why should we have to change hearts and minds? Like, what's going on that's making us have to change hearts and minds? I think, as I said, I'm a history and politics teacher, so I believe in the power of argument and the power of debate and, evidence-basing things. And I think the simplest thing is, well, look outside the institution, look at society as it currently is now in some places, not everywhere. Look at those who occupy high positions, who aren't necessarily championing inclusion and diversity. Trump in America and our Prime Minister here, they're not about getting the most out of everybody. And that's what happens. If you don't do it, then you live in a world where there is greater tension, there is less happiness, the fewer people who are hopeful, there is more pain and suffering. That doesn't sound fun for anybody, right? So why would you not want to champion diversity and inclusion? And I think one of the things in terms of arguments that have always stuck with me is kind of a political philosopher who I'm going to get this wrong, but I think he came up with this idea of the veil of ignorance. So if you are going to create a society, imagine you're doing that veiled and you don't know who you're going to be within that society. How able-bodied you will be, or what gender you will be, or what colour you will be, or all of these things, what your sexuality will be, what your religion will be. You don't know any of these things, and how would you therefore go about creating a fair and just society? Well, you would make sure that any barriers are broken down, that everybody has the potential to survive and thrive. And that's what I think is really important. None of us can control anything about who we are, but we can control who we can be and how we treat others, and that's what I would talk to people about. And I think, I've been doing, it's been an interesting time, hasn't it? Lockdown and this kind of summer period, and it's all been a bit, probably too much reflection has been going on in some places, and it's coincided with Black Lives Matter, and that's really affected me, actually, in that I was somebody who always embraced, I suppose, the woman part of my identity, the kind of feminist literature and the studies and all of that, and very much saw my place as a woman and what that means. But on race, I never really explored it that much. It's interesting, isn't it? You live it, obviously, but you don't necessarily think about it. But this summer, I have been thinking about it, and I've been reading, like a lot of people have. And, I don't have all of the answers. There's probably parts of my experience or my treatment of others or my thoughts that have been prejudicial or discriminatory, potentially. It's uncomfortable to think that, oh gosh, maybe that wasn't on, actually, or maybe I didn't consider the whole situation here when making a judgment about things. And I think that's another important thing. Not everybody is comfortable having these conversations. And I think as a leader, if you model your own vulnerability, particularly as a woman of colour, when you're having a conversation about, let's say, race in particular, because I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter, I think that's helpful. I think it draws other people to feel that they can kind of trust and have confidence in you, and that it's not going to be necessarily a conversation of judgment. You've got to explore this so that we can all get better at it. And that's what I would say in terms of changing hearts and minds. I'm not perfect. I'm flawed. We all are. We're human. But I want to be better, and I want to listen to others, and I want people to tell me when I've got it wrong. And that's hard. But I think if you say that, if you stand up and say, if you feel I've got this wrong, by all means come and talk to me, because I want to get it right, and I want to think about my words and my actions and the implications that they have.
Just going back to what you said about that kind of uncomfortable conversations and those uncomfortable feelings that we might have to sit with for a while are completely valid, aren't they? And the things that people experience. But I don't think you can create real change without there being a little bit of discomfort somewhere. And that will drive that change forward, hopefully, because people will recognise that there is something that needs changing. So in the second part of our webcast, we ask our guests to answer questions or dilemmas that are related to diversity and inclusion. And we've got an email that's been sent in. It says, "Dear Hannah and Amy, thank you for creating this opportunity for teachers to connect, as I am in need of some advice. I am the only Black teacher in my school, which has an ethnically diverse student population. I am often called upon by senior leaders to deal with Black students and parents. I am part of the pastoral team as a year leader, but I'm often called in to support members of staff with Black parents of students who aren't in my year group. I feel like I'm there because I'm the only Black face in the room. I don't know how to navigate this in my school. I want to be a visible role model and source of support for Black students, but I feel like I'm being used. I'll be grateful of any advice you can offer on this. Thank you."
That's quite what's the word that I want to use? That's quite a harrowing situation, because that actually stops her from doing the role that it is that they employed her for. And with her having to wear, I guess, so many different hats, there's only so much that she'd be able to do. And I think it's quite unfair for them to call upon her specifically for Black students. It would be very different if she was just called upon for behavior in general. So if it was that they've seen that how she just manages behavior in students in general and they were calling her throughout, then it might be a bit different. But the fact that, you know, just from, you know, what she has described, the fact that they're only calling her for Black students, I think for me, the advice that I would give is, one, is have that conversation to say, this is how I'm feeling. And obviously you know, it's not, it doesn't have to be a harsh conversation. It doesn't have to be one that, you know, is argumentative in that sense, but just have that conversation to say, this is how I'm feeling. But then also within that, what you're doing, almost documentize it, if that makes sense. And so give that the same strategies that you're using, give that to the pastoral department and say, okay, this is what I do. It's not any different to what I do with other students. Why don't you try this? So begin to give suggestions and say, okay, why don't you try this? Why don't you do that? Because she's not, you know, I would assume that she's not doing anything different that she would do with any other student. And I think, again, it's that difficult conversation does need to be had with the head teachers and other teachers, because if the school is ethnically diverse anyway, it cannot be that you have certain teachers dealing with certain types of students. That negates the objective of school and you wanting to champion for all students. It negates, you know, you being, you know, diversity and inclusion, because you have specifically selected one particular person to deal with a group of people. So yeah, I guess my advice for her would be, what you are doing, make it, you know, in a way that can be taught to others. And what you do, the strategies that you are using, suggest those to other teachers and say, no, actually, you deal with them. Actually, they're just like any other, because just from the situation she described, what that now says to me is that the culture of the school, and, you know, I may be getting this wrong, but the culture of the school is that Black students behave differently to white students. That's not what it is at all. Young people behave like young people. And they all do the same thing, regardless of color, regardless of faith, regardless of gender. Young people all do the same thing. They just, I guess, the behaviors display themselves in different ways depending on the situation. But how she deals with Black students is very much the same way with how she would deal with a white student or an Asian student or a Chinese student. It's young people are young people. And so for me, what that's saying now in terms of the culture of the school is that already they seem to deem that Black students are different, or students of color are different to white students. And that in itself is actually quite detrimental. And so that hard conversation does need to be had with the pastoral team, you know, with the head teacher, and just because what now needs to happen is changing the culture of the schools. Clearly she has the solutions because she's dealing with these students. So then begin to give the pastoral department the solutions that you already have, because they can see it and they know that you're doing it. The issue is that they're being very selective as to where they place you and what they're doing. And this is something that should be done for all students, not just, you know, Black students and because she's a Black teacher, because it now removes their responsibility as teachers. It removes their responsibilities to actually have to deal with that level of confrontation because of how they may view students of color. And I don't think that is right.
Just to say thanks for sharing that experience to begin with. It sounds quite lonely and isolating, so it's really useful, I think, Amy and Hannah, that there's this forum is obviously helping people already kind of get connected and ask for that advice. In terms of anything that I would just add, the points that have been made are really important in terms of documenting it so that you can have tangible examples of when it happens, so it isn't just a feeling, because sometimes that can be batted away, that, you know, on this date this happened, here this happened. And yes, the conversation should take place, but I would just think about whether you want it to be you raising that, or whether you would look for allies, so other people in your team who might be able to point it out to the line manager or senior leaders, if you would prefer that to happen. Because again, it's that responsibility thing. It shouldn't necessarily fall to that person. You might want to bring it up with members of your team, and they might feel, well, actually, yeah, it's true. You know, there's a workload issue here. Never mind a sort of just an injustice issue, or a tokenistic issue. There's lots of things at play, and then just listen to what is being said when that conversation happens. Really listen. It's hard. I've been in those places where I felt I've had to raise something and I'm just not in the right place to actually hear what's being said back to me, because I'm still quite angry. So, you know, that's why sometimes it's useful to have somebody else raising it, or you do it, and then write down what's said, or really listen to what's being said, particularly if you've proposed solutions and they're agreed. Then you go back to, well, we agreed this, I'm still seeing this, and then it's back to the other person to explain, or to try and find a way through.
Great advice, thank you both. So finally, from us, sad that this is coming to a close because I could just sit and listen to you both all day. We ask our guests to tell us what they're going to do to continue to be a rebel voice in education.
I will be here, take up space, and help others along the way.
I'll continue to be a champion of excellence for all students.
Thank you, both of you. And we can see that you are both on Twitter. So our viewers will connect with you there. And from all the advice and guidance and kind of experience that you've offered for us today, that will be really useful and valuable to our viewers. And I think it's really important that we keep hearing from people at different points in our career. Mamus, you are just going into leadership. Kiran, you're already there. And it's really important that we kind of gather and collate all of those experiences so that people can see that progression can be done and you can make change from wherever you are in your career. So thank you to both of you. And thank you to everybody who's watching this, wherever in the world that you are. Please do make sure that you like and subscribe to our channel so you can keep up to date with our webcasts. Tag us in on your comments on #Rebel Voices in Education on Twitter. Stay tuned for the information on next week's guests. Thank you very much, both of you. Bye-bye.